What happens when a man's dedication to his craft becomes the key to changing his entire life? Tonight, we share the remarkable story of Matthew Coleman, a 52-year-old aircraft mechanic at Westmont Regional Airport in Kansas. He was working double shifts to support his two teenagers when a storm delayed a private jet. It arrived with a critical engine failure that no one else could fix. What Matthew didn't know was that the mysterious passenger aboard that aircraft was Elizabeth Thornton, a Billionaire technology CEO traveling under an assumed name. She would witness his extraordinary skill and unwavering commitment to excellence. When Matthew collapsed from exhaustion after completing the most challenging repair of his career, he had no idea that this moment of vulnerability would become the catalyst for the most extraordinary opportunity of his lifetime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzzer cut through the pre-dawn darkness of the small apartment at 4:30 a.m. Matthew Coleman's weathered hand reached out from under the thin blanket, fumbling to silence the noise before it could wake his children. His body protested as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, every muscle aching from another 16-hour day at Westmont Regional Airport. The digital display on the clock seemed to mock him with its red numbers, reminding him that he'd managed only 3 hours of sleep again. Matthew sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, running calloused hands through his graying hair. The small bedroom felt even smaller in the darkness, cramped with the basic furniture he'd managed to keep after the medical bills had forced them to downsize. Through the thin walls, he could hear the neighbor's television playing some late-night movie, the muffled sound, a constant reminder of how little privacy their current living situation afforded. "Just get through today," he whispered to himself. The same mantra he'd been repeating for the past 2 years since Grace had passed. The funeral expenses, combined with the crushing medical debt from her cancer treatment, had transformed their comfortable middle-class life into a daily struggle for survival. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who looked older than his 52 years. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and the stress lines around his mouth seemed to deepen with each passing week. Matthew splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. His work uniform hung on the bathroom door, the blue coveralls bearing the Westmont Regional Airport logo, freshly washed, but showing the wear of countless hours spent crawling around aircraft engines. In the kitchen, Matthew quietly prepared his usual breakfast of instant coffee and toast, careful not to wake Hannah and Marcus Jr. The refrigerator hummed loudly, a concerning sound that meant another appliance was on the verge of breaking down. He made a mental note to check it later, adding it to the growing list of things that needed attention, but would have to wait until he could afford to fix them. A note stuck to the refrigerator door caught his attention, written in Hannah's careful handwriting. "Dad, don't forget about the parent-teacher conference Thursday. Also, Marcus needs new basketball shoes. His coach says the ones he has are unsafe. Love you." Matthew's heart sank as he calculated the cost of new athletic shoes against their already stretched budget. Hannah's senior year expenses were mounting, and Marcus Jr.'s growing feet seemed to outpace their ability to keep up with his needs. The parent-teacher conference would likely bring more requests for things they couldn't afford. College application fees, graduation expenses, class ring payments. His phone buzzed with a text message from Veronica Gutierrez, his supervisor at the airport. "Matt, can you come in early today? We've got a commercial jet with hydraulic issues that came in overnight. Customers pushing for a quick turnaround. Matthew typed back quickly. On my way in, 20 minutes. The extra hours meant additional overtime pay, money they desperately needed. Every emergency call, every weekend shift, every holiday worked was another small step toward financial stability. Matthew had been averaging 70-hour weeks for the past 6 months, taking on every available assignment to make ends meet. He grabbed his thermos of coffee and headed for the door, pausing to look back at the small apartment that had become their world. Family photos lined the hallway, reminders of better times when Grace was alive, and their biggest worry was whether to take a vacation to the mountains or the beach. Now, their biggest worry was whether the rent would be covered each month. The drive to Westmont Regional Airport took 25 minutes through the quiet Kansas streets. Dawn was beginning to break over the flat horizon, painting the sky in soft pink and orange hues that reminded Matthew of Grace's watercolor paintings. She used to wake early to capture the sunrise, claiming that the morning light held possibilities that the rest of the day couldn't match. Westmont Regional Airport sprawled across several hundred acres of prairie land, serving both commercial and private aircraft. The main terminal building stood against the morning sky, its control tower blinking with navigation lights. Hangars dotted the landscape like massive metal barns, each one housing aircraft worth millions of dollars. For Matthew, this place had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where his skills were valued but his time was consumed entirely. The maintenance facility hummed with activity even at this early hour. Aircraft don't adhere to normal business schedules, and neither do the people who keep them flying. Matthew badged into the building, the familiar smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and metal polish greeting him like an old friend. The concrete floors echoed with the sounds of air compressors, power tools, and the constant chatter of technicians coordinating repairs. "Morning, Matt," called Austin Reed, a younger mechanic who had been working at the facility for about 3 years. Austin was 29, single, and still had the energy that comes with not having the weight of family responsibilities. "Veronica's looking for you. That hydraulic job turned into something bigger." Matthew nodded, clocking in at the time station and grabbing his toolbox from his assigned locker. The metal box had been his companion for over 25 years, its drawers organized with the precision that comes from thousands of hours of experience. Each tool had its place, each instrument carefully maintained and ready for whatever challenge the day might bring. Veronica Gutierrez emerged from the supervisor's office, her expression mixing relief and concern. At 48, she had been managing the maintenance department for 8 years, and she knew that Matthew was her most reliable technician. She also knew he was pushing himself beyond sustainable limits. "Matt, thanks for coming in early," she said. "We've got a situation with that bombardier that came in last night. The hydraulic leak is worse than initially reported, and there are some electrical issues that seem related. The owner is some business executive who needs to be in Denver by noon." "What's the timeline looking like?" Matthew asked, already mentally cataloging the potential problems and solutions. "If we can get it diagnosed and repaired by 10 a.m., they can still make their meeting," Veronica replied. "The pilot seems competent, but he's concerned about the electrical issues. Says, there were some instrument warnings during landing that he's never seen before." Matthew followed Veronica across the hangar floor toward the private jet in question. The Bombardier Global 6000 sat elegantly in the maintenance bay, its white fuselage gleaming under the fluorescent lights. These aircraft represented the pinnacle of private aviation, worth upward of $60 million and equipped with technology that rivaled commercial airliners. "The passenger seems nice enough," Veronica continued as they walked. "Older woman traveling alone. She's waiting in the executive lounge. Pretty understanding about the delay. Goes by the name Beth Thomas, says she's in consulting." Matthew nodded absently, his attention already focused on the aircraft. The Bombardier's engine cowlings were open, revealing the complex turbofan engines that powered the jet. Hydraulic fluid stained the hangar floor beneath the left engine, indicating a leak that could range from minor seepage to major system failure. "Austin's been doing the initial inspection," Veronica explained. "But you know how these high-end aircraft can be. Sometimes what looks like a simple leak turns into a complete system overhaul, as..." They approached the aircraft. Matthew could see Austin Reed underneath the left wing, flashlight in hand, tracing hydraulic lines through the maze of components. The young mechanic's expression was one of concentration mixed with frustration, a look Matthew recognized from his own early years in aviation maintenance. "What have you got, Austin?" Matthew called out, setting his toolbox down and pulling on work gloves. Austin slid out from under the wing, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "It's not just a simple leak, Matt. The hydraulic reservoir is down about 40%, but I can't find where all that fluid went. There's evidence of leakage around the main pump, but not enough to account for what's missing." Matthew crouched down to examine the area Austin had been investigating. His trained eye immediately picked up details that experience had taught him to recognize. The pattern of fluid residue, the color and consistency of the leaked hydraulic fluid, the way certain components showed signs of stress or wear. "Hand me that inspection mirror," Matthew said, extending his hand without looking away from the aircraft. Austin quickly provided the tool, a small mirror on an adjustable handle that allowed mechanics to see into tight spaces. Using the mirror, Matthew peered into areas that couldn't be seen directly. Years of experience had taught him that aircraft systems were interconnected in ways that weren't always obvious. A hydraulic leak could be related to electrical problems, structural stress, or even environmental factors like extreme temperature changes. "There," Matthew said quietly, pointing to a spot deep within the engine compartment. "See that discoloration on the electrical harness? That's not just hydraulic fluid. That's evidence of electrical arcing." Austin leaned in to look where Matthew was pointing. "I don't see it." "Right there," Matthew said, "where the main electrical bundle passes near the hydraulic manifold. See how the insulation looks melted in that one spot? That's what happens when hydraulic fluid gets onto high-voltage electrical connections." The implications of Matthew's observation were significant. This wasn't just a maintenance issue. It was a potential safety hazard that could affect multiple aircraft systems. Hydraulic fluid on electrical connections could cause short circuits, system failures, or even electrical fires. Veronica had been listening to their conversation, and her expression grew more serious. "How long to fix something like that?" Matthew stood up, his knees protesting after crouching for several minutes. "Depends on how extensive the damage is," he said. "Could be a few hours if we're lucky. Could be most of the day if we need to replace major components. I'll need to do a complete system check before I know for sure." The morning was already slipping away, and Matthew knew that his day was about to become much longer than originally planned. But as he looked at the sophisticated aircraft in front of him, he felt the familiar surge of professional pride that came with tackling complex technical challenges. This was what he did best, and despite the exhaustion and financial pressure, he was good at it. "Let's get started," Matthew said, reaching for his diagnostic equipment. This is going to be interesting. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Matthew spent the next 2 hours methodically tracing the electrical and hydraulic systems throughout the bombardier's engine compartment. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward leak had evolved into a complex diagnostic puzzle that challenged even his decades of experience. The electrical harness damage extended further than he'd first realized, with multiple connection points showing signs of contamination and potential failure. "Veronica, I need you to see this," Matthew called from beneath the aircraft's wing. His supervisor approached, crouching down to peer into the cramped space where Matthew was working. "The hydraulic leak started here," Matthew explained, pointing to a fitting deep within the engine bay. "But the real problem is that this aircraft has been flying with this leak for weeks, maybe months. The hydraulic fluid has been misting onto the electrical systems every time the pumps engage during flight operations." Veronica's expression grew grave as she understood the implications. That means potential system failures could happen during critical flight phases. "Exactly," Matthew said. "Takeoff, landing, any time the hydraulic systems are under maximum load, the electrical contamination could cause multiple system failures simultaneously." Matthew's voice carried the weight of someone who understood that aircraft maintenance wasn't just about fixing problems, but about preventing catastrophes. Austin Reed had been listening to their conversation while organizing, tools nearby. At 29, he was still learning the intricacies of aviation maintenance, and moments like these provided invaluable education about the complexity of aircraft systems. "How do we fix something like this?" Austin asked, genuinely curious. Matthew carefully extracted himself from under the wing, his back aching from the awkward position. "First, we need to completely drain and flush the hydraulic system," he said. "Then we replace every contaminated electrical connection, test all related circuits, and rebuild the hydraulic manifold assembly. It's not difficult work, but it's time-consuming and requires absolute precision." The clock on the hangar wall showed 8:45 a.m., and Matthew calculated the hours needed for proper repairs. The passenger's noon deadline was becoming increasingly unrealistic, but rushing aircraft maintenance was never an option. Safety protocols existed for good reasons, written in regulations that had been developed through decades of aviation experience and, unfortunately, accidents. "I'll call the executive lounge and explain the situation," Veronica said. "Most experienced travelers understand that aircraft maintenance can't be rushed." As Veronica walked toward the office to make the call, Matthew began gathering the tools and parts he would need for the repair. The hangar's parts inventory contained most standard components, but some specialized electrical connectors might need to be ordered from suppliers. He hoped they had everything necessary to complete the job without delays. Austin approached with a parts manifest, checking items off as they gathered materials. "Matt, I've been watching how you diagnose these problems. How do you know where to look first?" "Experience, mostly," Matthew replied, selecting specialized electrical tools from his toolbox, "but also understanding how systems interact with each other. Aircraft aren't just collections of individual components. Everything affects everything else. When you see a hydraulic leak, you have to consider what else might be affected by that leak." The teaching moment reminded Matthew of his early days in aviation maintenance, when Vincent Ramirez had been his mentor. Vincent had taught him that being a good mechanic meant thinking beyond the immediate problem to understand the broader implications of any system failure. "In this case," Matthew continued, Hydraulic fluid is designed to operate under extreme pressure and temperature. When it leaks onto electrical systems, it doesn't just create a mess. It can conduct electricity, causing short circuits. It can also break down insulation materials, leading to long-term electrical problems. As they worked, the morning progressed. With the steady rhythm of methodical repair procedures, Matthew's hands moved with practiced efficiency, each action deliberate and precise. Draining the hydraulic system required careful attention to environmental regulations, ensuring that no fluids were spilled or improperly disposed of. Around 10:30 a.m., Veronica returned from the office with an update. "I spoke with the passenger," she said. "She's very understanding about the delay, says safety is more important than schedules, and she'd rather have the aircraft properly repaired than rush the job." "Smart woman," Matthew commented, carefully inspecting an electrical connector under a magnifying lamp. "Most people in private aviation understand the stakes involved." She asked if she could observe the repair process. Says she's curious about aircraft maintenance. I told her it would be fine as long as she stays clear of the work area and wears safety equipment. Matthew nodded absently. His attention focused on the delicate work of replacing contaminated electrical connections. Each connector had to be cleaned, inspected, and properly installed to manufacturer specifications. The repair manual lay open beside him, its pages marked with notes from previous similar repairs. A few minutes later, a woman in her mid-40s approached the work area. She wore casual but expensive-looking clothes and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she observed the maintenance operation with genuine interest rather than impatience. "I'm Beth Thomas," she said, introducing herself to Matthew. "I understand you're the mechanic working on my aircraft." Matthew looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Matthew Coleman," he said. "Sorry about the delay, but we found some issues that need proper attention before this aircraft is safe to fly." "Please don't apologize," Beth replied. "I appreciate thorough work. May I ask what the problem is?" Matthew was struck by her genuine interest in the technical details. Most passengers wanted to know when the aircraft would be ready, not how the repairs were being performed. He explained the hydraulic leak and electrical contamination in terms that a non-technical person could understand. "So this could have caused problems during flight?" Beth asked. "Potentially, yes," Matthew replied. "Hydraulic systems control critical flight functions like landing gear, flight controls, and braking systems. Electrical problems could affect navigation, communications, or engine management systems. It's better to fix everything properly on the ground than to deal with emergencies in the air." Beth nodded thoughtfully. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" 26 years in aviation maintenance," Matthew said. "Started right out of high school, worked my way up through different types of aircraft." Matthew returned his attention to the electrical connection he was installing, but continued the conversation as he worked. "It must be satisfying work," Beth remarked, "knowing that people's safety depends on your expertise." "It is," Matthew agreed, "though it can be stressful too. There's no margin for error in aviation maintenance. Everything has to be done right the first time." Austin Reed had been listening to their conversation while organizing tools nearby. He was impressed by how patiently Matthew explained technical concepts to the passenger, taking time he didn't really have to ensure she understood the importance of proper maintenance procedures. "Matt's one of the best mechanics in this region," Austin added. He saved our department on dozens of complicated repairs. Management calls him in whenever there's a problem nobody else can solve. Matthew felt slightly uncomfortable with the praise, but Beth Thomas seemed genuinely interested in their work. She asked thoughtful questions about maintenance schedules, regulatory requirements, and the training necessary to become certified for aircraft maintenance. "Do you work exclusively on private aircraft?" she asked. "No," Matthew replied. "We service everything that comes through Westmont Regional. Commercial airliners, private jets, cargo planes, even some military aircraft when they need facilities. Each type has its own challenges and requirements." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Benjamin Ward, the pilot who would be flying the Bombardier once repairs were completed. Captain Ward was a seasoned aviator in his 50s with the calm demeanor that comes from decades of professional flight experience. "How are we looking, Matthew?" Captain Ward asked, reviewing the maintenance log book where all work was being documented. "Making good progress," Matthew replied. "I should have everything buttoned up within the next 2 hours. The hydraulic system is clean and refilled, and I'm finishing the electrical connections now. I'll need to run a complete system check before I sign off on the work." "Take your time," Captain Ward said. "I'd rather be late than have problems at altitude." Captain Ward turned to Beth Thomas. "Ma'am, I know this delay is inconvenient, but Matthew's reputation for thorough work is why I recommended this facility for the repair." "I'm learning a great deal watching the process," Beth replied. "It's fascinating to see the level of detail and precision required." As the morning progressed toward noon, Matthew's fatigue began to show more clearly. He had been working for 8 hours straight after only 3 hours of sleep, and the complex nature of the repairs demanded sustained concentration. His movements remained precise, but Austin noticed that he was taking longer breaks and occasionally pausing to rest his eyes. "Matt, you want me to take over for a while?" Austin offered. "You've been going nonstop since early this morning?" "I'm fine," Matthew replied automatically, though his voice carried a weariness that suggested otherwise. "Just need to finish these last few connections and run the system tests." Beth Thomas had been observing Matthew's work for over an hour, and she noticed the signs of exhaustion that he was trying to hide. The careful precision of his movements, the way he double-checked every connection, the obvious pride he took in his work despite being clearly tired. "Mr. Coleman," she asked with concern, "when was the last time you took a proper break?" Matthew paused in his work, realizing that he couldn't remember his last real day off. "I work most days," he said. "My family needs the income, so I take whatever shifts are available." "That must be difficult," Beth said, "maintaining this level of concentration when you're working so many hours." "You do what you have to do," Matthew said simply, returning to his work on the electrical connections. The conversation revealed more about Matthew's situation than he usually shared with customers. Something about Beth Thomas's genuine interest and non-judgmental questions made him feel comfortable discussing the realities of his life. Most passengers viewed maintenance personnel as invisible service providers, but she seemed to see him as a person with expertise and challenges. As Matthew began the final system checks, the afternoon sun streamed through the hangar's large windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The Bombardier's engines would need to be started and tested Hydraulic systems cycled through their full range of operations, and all electrical systems verified as functioning properly. "This is the critical part," Matthew explained to Beth as she continued to observe. "All the repair work is meaningless if the systems don't function correctly when tested under actual operating conditions. The testing process would take another hour, but it was essential to ensure that the aircraft was safe for flight." Matthew's reputation and professional certification depended on the quality of his work, and more importantly, the lives of everyone who would fly in the aircraft depended on his thoroughness. As he prepared to begin the final testing sequence, Matthew felt the familiar satisfaction that came with solving complex technical problems. Despite his exhaustion and the long hours, he was good at this work, and he knew it. What he didn't know was that his dedication and expertise were being carefully observed by someone who had the power to change his entire future. The final testing phase required Matthew to power up the Bombardier's engines while monitoring dozens of gauges, readouts, and system indicators. He climbed into the cockpit, his tired body settling into the pilot seat as he began the systematic process of bringing the aircraft systems online. The cockpit's sophisticated instrument panel came alive with digital displays and warning lights that would indicate any problems with the repairs he had just completed. "Austin, I need you on the ground monitoring the engine bay," Matthew called through the balcony. "The cockpit window. Watch for any signs of leakage, unusual sounds, or visual abnormalities during the engine start sequence." Austin positioned himself near the left engine with a fire extinguisher and radio, standard safety protocol, during maintenance engine runs. Beth Thomas stood at a safe distance, her attention focused intently on the testing procedure. Captain Ward reviewed the maintenance documentation while staying ready to assist if needed. The first engine started smoothly, its turbofans spinning up to idle speed with the distinctive whistle that characterizes modern jet engines. Matthew carefully monitored the hydraulic pressure readings, electrical system status, and engine parameters displayed on the multi-function screens before him. Each gauge told part of the story about how well his repairs had addressed the original problems. "Engine 1 looking good," Austin reported over the radio. "No visible leaks, normal exhaust signature. All external indicators appear normal." Matthew nodded and initiated the start sequence for the second engine. The startup procedure for each engine took several minutes, during which dozens of automatic systems checks verified that everything was functioning within acceptable parameters. His experienced eye caught subtle variations in readings that might indicate developing problems, but so far, everything appeared normal. With both engines running at idle, Matthew began cycling through the hydraulic system tests. Landing gear, retraction and extension, flight control surface movements, brake system pressure checks. Each test stressed different components of the systems he had repaired, verifying that the work could withstand the demands of actual flight operations. "Hydraulic system responding normally," Matthew announced. "Pressure holding steady, no fluctuations during load cycling." The electrical system tests came next, more complex procedures that verified the integrity of every connection and the systems Matthew had cleaned and replaced. Navigation systems, communication radios, engine management computers, flight control systems. The aircraft's sophisticated electronics had to coordinate seamlessly for safe flight operations. As Matthew worked through the systematic testing procedures, his exhaustion began manifesting in subtle ways. His movements were still precise, but slightly slower than usual. He found himself double-checking readings he would normally trust immediately. The concentration required for complex testing procedures was demanding more effort than it should have. "Matt, all readings look good from where I'm standing," Austin called over the radio. "Everything seems to be responding normally to your inputs." "Copy that," Matthew replied. "Running the final electrical load tests now." Matthew's voice carried the fatigue he was trying to suppress, but his professional discipline kept him focused on completing every required procedure. Beth Thomas watched the testing process with fascination, impressed by the thoroughness and systematic approach Matthew employed. She had observed many professionals in various industries, but rarely had she seen someone who combined technical expertise with such obvious dedication to doing the job correctly, regardless of personal cost. The electrical load tests required Matthew to activate multiple systems simultaneously, creating the kind of power demands the aircraft would experience during normal flight operations. Cabin pressurization, environmental controls, navigation systems, communications equipment, all drawing power while the engines provided electrical generation. "Electrical systems stable under full load," Matthew reported. "All voltages within normal parameters, no fluctuations or anomalies detected." Captain Ward approached the cockpit window. "Matthew, everything looks excellent from my perspective," he said. "The maintenance documentation shows you've addressed all the original problems, plus several others that could have become serious issues. This is exactly the kind of thorough work that keeps aircraft safe." The praise felt good, but Matthew was too tired to fully appreciate it. He had been working for nearly 10 hours with minimal breaks, most of that time spent in physically demanding positions or requiring intense concentration. His body was sending clear signals that it needed rest, but he pushed through to complete the final testing requirements. "One more test sequence," Matthew said, initiating the flight control system check. This procedure moved all the aircraft's control surfaces through their full range of motion while monitoring the electrical and hydraulic systems that powered them: ailerons, elevators, rudder, spoilers, trim tabs. Each surface had to move smoothly and respond correctly to cockpit inputs. As the control surfaces cycled through their movements, Matthew monitored the cockpit displays that showed system status and control positions. The repairs appeared to be completely successful, with all systems functioning normally under the kind of loads they would experience during actual flight. "Control surfaces responding normally," he announced. "Full deflection in all directions, no binding or hesitation, hydraulic pressure maintaining properly throughout the cycle." Beth Thomas had been observing for over 3 hours now, and she couldn't help but notice how Matthew's professionalism never wavered, despite his obvious fatigue. His commitment to completing every required test, his patience in explaining procedures to Austin, his thorough documentation of all work performed. "Mr. Coleman," she said during a brief pause in the testing, "how often do you encounter problems this complex?" Matthew looked up from the instrument panel, grateful for a moment to rest his eyes. "Complex problems are fairly common in aviation," he said. "Maintenance aircraft operate in demanding environments, and systems interact in ways that can create unexpected issues. The key is understanding how everything works together. And you've developed that understanding over 26 years, Beth said. "Experience helps," Matthew replied. "But you also have to keep learning. Aircraft technology evolves constantly. New systems are introduced, Regulations change. Staying current requires ongoing education and training. Austin Reed had been listening to their conversation while monitoring the external systems. He was struck by how Matthew continued teaching and sharing knowledge, even when clearly exhausted. Most people in his condition would focus solely on completing the immediate task, Austin said. Matt's always sharing what he knows. He's taught me more about complex diagnostics in the past year than I learned in my formal training programs. The comment reminded Matthew of Vincent Ramirez, his own mentor, who had invested time and patience in developing Matthew's skills during his early career. Passing knowledge to the next generation of mechanics was part of the unwritten responsibilities that came with experience and expertise. Knowledge is only valuable if it's shared, Matthew said simply. Austin's got good instincts and strong technical skills. He just needs exposure to more complex problems to develop his diagnostic abilities. The final test sequence involved running both engines at higher power settings while monitoring all systems under increased stress. This was the most demanding part of the testing process, requiring Matthew to manage multiple controls simultaneously while watching for any signs of problems. As the engine spooled up to higher power settings, the noise level in the hangar increased dramatically. The distinctive sound of turbofan engines under load filled the space. A deep rumbling punctuated by the high-pitched whine of compressor stages operating at maximum efficiency. Matthew's hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced precision, adjusting power settings while monitoring dozens of gauges and indicators. Engine temperatures, pressures, vibration levels, electrical outputs, hydraulic flows. Any abnormal reading could indicate a problem that would require additional repairs. Engine parameters all normal, he reported over the increased noise. Hydraulic systems maintaining pressure under high load conditions, electrical generation stable across all power settings. The high-power testing continued for 15 minutes, stressing every system Matthew had repaired while verifying that the aircraft could safely handle the demands of normal flight operations. His concentration never wavered, but the physical and mental strain of maintaining such focused attention was becoming increasingly difficult. Beth Thomas noticed that Matthew was gripping the controls more tightly than seemed necessary, his knuckles showing white with tension. She could see the effort it was taking him to maintain the precise control inputs required for the testing procedures. "How much longer for the testing?" she asked Captain Ward quietly. "He's almost finished," Captain Ward replied. "Just needs to complete the high-power checks and then shut everything down. Maybe 10 more minutes." As Matthew began the engine shutdown procedures, carefully following the prescribed sequence to avoid damaging the sophisticated turbofan engines, he felt a wave of satisfaction mixed with relief. The repairs had been completely successful, and the aircraft was now safe for flight operations. "All tests completed successfully," he announced, as the engines wound down to silence. "Aircraft is ready for flight operations. All discrepancies have been corrected, and all systems are functioning normally." Austin Reed approached the cockpit as Matthew began gathering his testing equipment. "Matt, that was incredible work," Austin said. "I learned more watching this repair than I have in months of routine maintenance." "Glad I could help," Matthew replied, climbing down from the cockpit with movements that showed his exhaustion more clearly now that the critical work was finished. "The important thing is that the aircraft is safe. That's what matters most. Captain." Ward shook Matthew's hand firmly. "Outstanding work as always," he said. I'll make sure this gets documented properly in our maintenance records. This kind of thorough repair work is exactly why we bring aircraft here." As Matthew began the process of cleaning up his tools and completing the required paperwork, he felt the familiar satisfaction that came with solving complex technical problems. But underneath that satisfaction was a bone-deep weariness that he could no longer ignore. His body was telling him in no uncertain terms that he had pushed too hard for too long. Beth Thomas approached him as he packed his tools. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "I want to thank you for explaining the repair process and for the obvious care you took with the work. It's clear that this aircraft is in better condition now than when it arrived." "Just doing my job," Matthew replied, though he appreciated her genuine gratitude. "Safe travels, and I hope the rest of your trip goes smoothly?" What Matthew didn't realize was that Beth Thomas had been evaluating much more than just his technical skills during the long repair process. She had observed his work ethic, his teaching ability, his commitment to safety, and his obvious expertise in solving complex problems. She had also noticed his exhaustion and the personal challenges that drove him to work such demanding schedules. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the hangar windows, casting long shadows across the maintenance area, Matthew began the final documentation of his work. But the combination of extreme fatigue, sustained stress, and the physical demands of 10 hours of intensive labor was about to catch up with him in ways he never expected. The paperwork required after completing major aircraft repairs was extensive and critical. Matthew sat at a small desk in the maintenance office, filling out Federal Aviation Administration forms that documented every aspect of the work performed. Each repaired component, every test conducted, all parts replaced, and the technician certifications authorizing the aircraft's return to service. His handwriting, normally neat and precise, showed slight tremors from exhaustion. "Aircraft maintenance record entry," Matthew wrote carefully. "Hydraulic system leak corrected. Electrical harness contamination repaired. All affected components cleaned, tested, and certified airworthy. Systems check completed satisfactory. Aircraft approved for return to service." The documentation process required Matthew to reference technical manuals, parts catalogs, and regulatory requirements to ensure complete accuracy. Any error in the paperwork could ground the aircraft or create legal liability for the maintenance facility. Despite his fatigue, Matthew's professional training kept him focused on getting every detail correct. Beth Thomas had remained in the hangar area, ostensibly waiting for the final paperwork to be completed before departure. In reality, she was continuing to observe Matthew's work habits and professional standards. She watched him methodically complete each form, double-checking entries against his notes and the aircraft's maintenance logbook. "Veronica, could you review these entries before I sign off?" Matthew called to his supervisor, following standard procedure for major repairs. All significant maintenance work required supervisory review and countersignature to ensure quality control and regulatory compliance. Veronica Gutierrez approached the desk, reviewing Matthew's documentation with the practiced eye of someone who had overseen thousands of aircraft maintenance operations. She checked that all required fields were completed, that the work descriptions matched the actual repairs performed, and that all regulatory requirements had been met. "Everything looks complete and accurate," Veronica confirmed. "Your work on this aircraft was exceptional, Matt. The customer is getting a lot more value than they paid for." As Matthew signed his technician certification on the final form, his hand paused momentarily. The signature that authorized the aircraft's return to service represented more than paperwork. It was his professional guarantee that the work had been performed correctly and that the aircraft was safe for flight operations. Austin Reed had been organizing tools and cleaning the work area while Matthew completed the documentation. He noticed that Matthew was taking longer than usual to complete routine paperwork tasks, and that his normally steady hands showed slight shakiness when handling the forms. "Matt, you've been going for over 10 hours straight," Austin said with concern. "Maybe you should take a break before finishing up here." "Almost done," Matthew replied, though his voice carried a weariness that suggested he was running on determination alone. "Just need to complete the logbook entries and get everything filed properly." The aircraft logbook required detailed entries describing the maintenance performed, parts installed, and testing completed. These permanent records would travel with the aircraft throughout its operational life, providing future maintenance technicians with critical information about repairs and modifications. Matthew's entries needed to be clear, complete, and technically accurate. As he wrote the final logbook entry, Matthew felt a strange lightness in his head, as if the hangar around him was becoming less substantial. He attributed the sensation to fatigue and continued working, determined to complete all required documentation before acknowledging his exhaustion. Beth Thomas noticed Matthew's increasingly pale complexion and the way he occasionally paused to steady himself against the desk. Her concern was growing, but she hesitated to interfere with procedures she didn't fully understand. She had observed enough to recognize that Matthew was pushing himself beyond reasonable limits. "Mr. Coleman," she said quietly, "are you feeling all right? You look like you might need to rest." Matthew looked up from the logbook, trying to focus on her face. The fluorescent lights in the maintenance office seemed unusually bright, and he was having difficulty concentrating on the words he was writing. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired. Long day, but I've had longer." The statement wasn't entirely truthful. Matthew had worked many long days, but rarely under such intense pressure and complex technical demands. The combination of physical exertion, mental concentration, and emotional stress was taking a toll that his body could no longer accommodate.